The House will be in order. The prayer will be offered by the guest chaplain, Pastor Mark Westerfield, Central Baptist Church, Round Rock in Round Rock, Texas.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, I am humbled to stand before you and these honored and distinguished men and women today, to stand in the gap and offer this prayer. Today, we gratefully recognize the gift of life, liberty, and responsibility you have given us to lead this great country. On behalf of these men and women, I ask for wisdom, discernment, and unity as they carry the weight of caring for the close to 350 million citizens of this land. They carry the weight of protecting all lives and making sure that justice is paramount. We stand today on the backs of many that have gone before, and we stand grateful that you have shown grace and mercy to each of us. Please give each of these servants the skin of a rhino and the heart of a lamb. We humbly ask this in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor. The chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House the approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Repeat after me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Carter, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to introduce my longtime friend, Pastor Mark Westerfield, who I've had the honor of hosting as our guest chaplain in the House today. Mark is the senior pastor at Central Baptist Church in my hometown of Round Rock, Texas, where he began his ministry nearly 40 years ago. Under his leadership, Central Baptist has expanded to a house of worship services, a variety of ministries, Bible studies, and the prestigious Round Rock Christian Academy. His impact has extended far beyond the walls of his church. He's been instrumental in organizing the annual Love the Rock volunteer event that marshals volunteers from 40 different churches to unite on a single day in service to help their neighbors in Round Rock. Mark embodies what is great about the close-knit Central Texas community where I live and how we come together to make our city a better place to live. I'm grateful that Mark Westerfield is joining us as our guest chaplain, and I yield back.
The chair will entertain up to 5 further requests for 1-minute speeches on each side. For the purpose of the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition. Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Roger Zakheim, Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute and former General Counsel of the House Armed Services Committee, published an op-ed on Wednesday in the Washington Post calling for freeing American hostages from Iran puppet Hamas terrorists. Quote, shifting away from mediation to a more aggressive stance to demonstrate that the United States does not leave its citizens behind. End of quote. Corrupt Judge Merchan qualifies daily for my invitation as guest for the Trump inauguration as Merchan re-elects Donald Trump. I am glad untrue, false, salacious details of Merchan perverted sexual conduct has not been admitted as lies of Merchan untrue, fabricated, illegal conduct is ignored. Donald Trump will be re-elected due to the rejection of corrupt Judge Merchan derangement. In conclusion, God bless our troops who have successfully protected America for 20 years in the global war on terrorism as it moves from the Afghanistan safe haven to America. We do not need new border laws. We need to enforce existing border laws. Biden shamefully opens the borders for dictators as more 9/11 attacks across America are imminent, as warned by the FBI. Christians appreciate the courage of the truth of Kansas City kicker Harrison Butler. Coach Lou Holtz is correct. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to honor the life of Reverend William Bill Lawson. Reverend Lawson was a giant in Houston. He was a warrior against the evils of discrimination, of poverty, of homelessness, lifting basic dignity to its highest heights. During the peak season of the civil rights era, he was a key leader in Houston, where his best work was often behind the scenes. A patron for peace, Reverend Lawson organized quiet desegregation of Houston through secret meetings with the business community, a plan that kept away violence and bombings that were rampant across the South. Reverend Lawson was always on the right side of good trouble. The positivity he brought to our community will be felt for years to come. Houston will miss Reverend Lawson and his quiet demeanor and his endearing smile. I send my love and condolences to the entire Lawson family as we remember him and all that he accomplished. Well done, good and faithful servant. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was born and raised in Iowa, and I've always known that it was the place that I wanted to live and raise my family. And recently, the U.S. News and World Report caught up to what Iowans have known for a long time and officially ranked Iowa as one of the best states to live. They also ranked Iowa third for new opportunities. Under Governor Kim Reynolds, Iowa is flourishing. While President Biden spent trillions of taxpayer dollars on woke priorities and created rampant inflation, Iowa cut taxes for families. While President Biden opened our borders and allowed countless illegal immigrants to invade, Iowa is working to deport illegals who endanger our communities. Iowa is a model for the rest of the country. Our prosperity under Governor Reynolds is the perfect contrast to Joe Biden's national failures. Iowa is leading the way with common sense conservatism, and our future is bright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as we commemorate National Police Week, I want to take a moment to honor the memory of Wicomico County Sheriff's Deputy Glenn Hilliard, a heroic Maryland Eastern Shore police officer who was killed in the line of duty while protecting his community from a violent criminal. Unfortunately, an all too often occurrence in today's America. In the evening hours of June 12, 2022, Officer Hilliard received a call that a fleeing fugitive was in the surrounding area. While certainly potentially dangerous, this call wasn't much different from the hundreds of calls for help the Wicomico County Police Department and police departments across the country receive daily as they confront crime to protect our communities. Sadly, for Officer Hilliard, this call to duty would be his last. He pursued the wanted criminal. The fugitive turned and fled and fired, ultimately taking the life of Officer Hilliard. As Officer Hilliard's family reminds us, he died doing what he loved and left behind a legacy of selflessly defending his community. In the end, it was not the way Officer Hilliard died, but the way he lived. As we honor National Police Week, let's take a moment to thank the many police officers who risked their lives so we can be safe. May the memory of Officer Glenn Hilliard and all our fallen police officers never be forgotten. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Tennessee seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my incredible remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate you letting me speak today. I want to recognize the good folks at Pratt's Country Store in Fountain City. They've been longtime friends of mine and my family's. Perry Pratt's grandfather and brother bought the acreage in the 20s, and it's been family-owned and family-operated ever since, Mr. Speaker. Pratt sells fresh produce, dairy, baked goods, and fruits, and my mom always loved to shop there, and I always like to stop there as well. The whole family grew up working in and around the store, and you can tell they treat everyone like family when they walk in. And I've also never have to worry about where the produce come from, Mr. Speaker, because Pratt's is known for locally sourcing their food from East Tennessee farmers. I also love walking into Pratt's because it just smells good. It smells like an old country store, and it smells fresh, and it smells clean. They do things the old-fashioned way, and they make people feel like they're stepping back in time. Ralph and Perry Pratt were recently honored as Fountain City's Men of the Year due to their amazing customer service. And everyone that goes to Pratt's Country Store knows how delicious everything is, and they have some really great vegetables. As good as their produce is, though, Mr. Speaker, they're best known for the family atmosphere. They're God-fearing people, and they've always been respected in our community. They've been here for 3 generations for a reason. I want them to know they're appreciated, and I hope they're around for several more generations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Doing a 1 minute. Hey, manager. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 1227, I call up House Resolution 1213 and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 1213, resolution regarding violence against law enforcement officers.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1227, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debated for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Jurisdiction or their respective designees. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to welcome so many fine men and women in blue here in our nation's capital for Police Week. However, as always, I'm concerned every day for the safety and well-being of these brave men and women in the communities across this great nation where they live and work. Radical policies in states and cities across the country continue to promote a disastrous rise in crime and a dangerous environment for police officers. Now more than ever, we must show our support for our law enforcement officers. As a former local prosecutor, I know just how important a robust police force is to keeping our communities safe. For effective crime deterrence, you need prosecutors willing to pursue convictions and judges willing to sentence and incarcerate. But first and foremost, you need police willing to arrest and charge offenders for crimes committed. And you need local and state governments willing to fund and support our police forces. Let me be clear. This effort to defund the police has had a detrimental impact on efforts to combat crime, but also on recruitment, retention, and morale among our law enforcement officers. In Democrat-run cities across the country, areas where they defunded the police saw a spike in crime and continue to struggle today with keeping their cities safe. Despite Democrats' calls to defund the police and the emotional toll that that takes, we know that law enforcement officers answer every call for help, regardless of who the person is, what they believe, and regardless of the threat to their own lives. So many of those brave men and women who answer the call of duty, put on the uniform, go to work in the morning, never return home in the evening. Today, there are 23,785 names of law enforcement officers who have been killed in the line of duty that are inscribed on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial here in Washington, D.C. Words can never express our gratitude to each and every individual whose name is on that wall. Unfortunately, we still see warning signs that the environment does not show any promise of becoming safer. According to the Fraternal Order of Police, 378 officers were shot in the line of duty in 2023, the highest number recorded since FOP began collecting the data. So far in 2024, 136 officers have been shot. That must end. That is completely unacceptable. We must take a stand against these attacks and honor our fallen law enforcement officers. This resolution does just that. This resolution condemns calls to defund the police. It also recognizes that law enforcement officers must have the training and the resources necessary to protect the health and safety of the public, as well as their fellow law enforcement officers on the job. We must never forget those who have made the ultimate sacrifice in the line of duty. It is up to us in Congress to honor their memories and to stand up and protect those who do so much to protect us. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
On August 29, 2002, two deputy sheriffs in Prince George's County, Elizabeth Magruder and James Arno, were ambushed in the home of the shooter's family. They'd been called to the house to execute a warrant, a health warrant, because the parents were concerned about the erratic behavior of their son. Elizabeth Magruder was shot in the back of the head, and James Arno was shot and killed as well. He left behind a wife, 2 children, and 2 grandchildren. She left behind a husband and a 3-year-old son. I had just been elected state's attorney in Prince George's County, but I hadn't even been sworn in yet. And so one of my first duties was to attend the funerals for both of them. And my first memorial service during Police Week was in their honor. So I take this very seriously. The National Police Week commemoration, I think, is something that is very grave, and we should treat with great respect. And unfortunately, the ambush that Magruder and Arno faced that day, those haven't ended. We just saw recently the ambush in Charlotte. 4 officers were killed, 8 were shot, and we've had others like that all over the country. So my thought when we had Police Week approaching was that we would approach this in a bipartisan manner. And I actually reached out and worked with Congressman Hunt from Texas, and we put together a bill that was aimed at expanding the number of police officers because we know that there are shortages across the country, and we know that we need to increase the pipeline so more officers will come and take on these dangerous tasks and stand in harm's way, stand in the gap, as the pastor said this morning. And it was a bipartisan effort, came out of the committee by voice vote, was passed on the floor in a similar capacity. The Senate companion bill is passed as well, and we're looking forward to that becoming the law of the land in short order. Unfortunately, much of the legislation that's come after that has been anything but bipartisan. And the legislation we're speaking to today, I'm afraid, falls in that category. When I took a look at the bill, HRES 1213, I'd hoped to see praise go out to our officers across the country for the work that they do, and the officers who've lost their lives in the line of duty. And indeed, there are paragraphs that speak to that. But unfortunately, there's passages that don't. And my colleague from Virginia, in his comments a few moments ago, made some of the same kinds of comments with respect to, for example, the defund the police argument. Now, somehow, my Republican colleagues have concluded that defund the police, a phrase that was used several years ago, is somehow fueling the rise of crime, and in this particular instance, the death and attacks against police officers. But as I just mentioned a moment ago, Magruder and Arno were killed in 2002, over 20 years ago. And we know we've been seeing deaths by officers in the line of duty for decades now. It's nothing new. So to kind of casually blame it on a slogan that I'm not aware of anybody in the body here today that espoused that, certainly I didn't. To pretend that that's the reason that these shootings are occurring, that these killings are occurring, is, I think, unfortunate and an abuse of what this week is supposed to mean. Now, in addition, I would say this. I just mentioned that I don't know that anybody supports the defund the police slogan from a few years ago, but we do have colleagues in the House right now, a House Republican, who has a bill, H.R. 374, to defund ATF, and we have House Republican colleagues who called for the defunding of the FBI. Now, the irony of that, as those of us who've worked in law enforcement know, I was a prosecutor for 12 years, 4 in the federal level, 8 as the locally elected state's attorney. But the local and federal prosecutors work together all of the time. And it's critical, and sometimes they work together in task forces because they can bring the local, the state, and the federal forces to bear and provide maximum support in protecting our communities. But unfortunately, this piece of legislation and much of the legislation that's been discussed this week, that's been offered by my Republican colleagues, intentionally ignores federal law enforcement. In fact, we had one that was marked up in my committee, Judiciary Committee, where I offered an amendment to include federal law enforcement, and it was expressly rejected on a party line vote by my Republican colleagues. And I gotta say, you know, FBI, ATF, Border Patrol, they put their lives on the line too, and we should respect them as well. And so one of the reasons I can't support this legislation is that it really is disrespectful to those federal officers. But the other, I guess, is back to the defund the police issue. There's a recognition in the legislation where it talks about the number of officers who've died in the line of duty in 2021, 2022, and 2023. And I can talk about the specific numbers in a moment when we move forward in the debate. But one provision actually notes that 378 law enforcement officers were shot in the line of duty in 2023. And the one common thread between the vast majority of officers who've been killed in the line of duty, like Arno and Magruder, like the people who were ambushed in Charlotte, like most of the people with the names on the wall just a few blocks away from here, is they were shot. Now, sadly, my Republican colleagues are unable, unwilling, unsomething to take a step to address that gun violence. And, you know, the resolution here speaks in terms of defunding the police as the cause of their deaths. But all of us know that the greatest threat that these officers face is not being stabbed to death, is not being beaten to death with a slogan like defund the police, it's being shot to death. And just briefly, 2022, these are numbers from the cops working with the National Fraternal Order of Police. A total of 331 law enforcement officers were shot in the line of duty during calendar year 2022, and 267 separate shooting incidents, including 42 incidents where multiple officers were shot. Now, I appreciate the fact that we're going to offer resolutions to praise officers, but if we're really serious about protecting them, it's hard to ignore a data point like that. Yet our officers have to go out there knowing that they face these threats all the time. They go, traffic stops are particularly dangerous, but sometimes in the home, like for Arnaud and Magruder. They can be ambushed there, sometimes like in Charlotte. They can be ambushed in the open air. But taking that seriously, I think, is an important piece. Yet the resolution doesn't even mention it. And I'll say this, and then I'll take a pause here for a moment. But there's legislation pending right now in the House of Representatives. I offered one, assault weapons ban. I think I figured it might be a bridge too far for me to ask my Republican colleagues to co-sponsor that. So I came up with a bill. It's called Raise the Age, and it would elevate the age from 18 to 21 to purchase assault weapons. And I thought that would be a reasonable bill to offer because there was already a provision in the law for handguns. You had to be 21 to purchase a handgun. And I believe that was put in place during the Reagan era. Now, for my bill, raising it to 21, you got to be 21 to buy alcohol. I thought it might make sense to be 21 to buy an assault weapon as well. And I think we have 170 plus co-sponsors for that bill. But none of them are Republican, not one. Even though Republicans had agreed to legislation similar to that in previous years. So, I'll speak in a moment about the resources issue as well. In the 117th Congress, Democrats supported legislation to provide equipment to police officers. We'll get into the particular numbers of that in a moment. But none of that's moving forward here in the House now, and none of it is certainly moving forward in Police Week. But I just want to point out one little factoid, too, from the COPS document that I mentioned before. It's under the heading Bullet-Resistant Vests. At least 34 officers were protected from gunshots that struck a protective ballistic vest. Yet, we're struggling to find a way to provide additional support and equipment for officers to help them stay safe on the street. That's what we ought to be doing during Police Week. And to the extent we're going to talk in terms of resolutions in support of officers, let's strip out the political nonsense. The defund the police stuff, I think, really has no place in helping to protect police officers and make them safe. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's a slap in the face the way these legislative provisions have been proposed to always exclude federal law enforcement. I know you guys have issues on the other side about some of them, but I think this isn't the time or the place to express it in that way. Federal law enforcement deserves the same kinds of respect, the same kind of appreciation, the same kind of protection that local and state law enforcement officers do. So I'm going to urge my colleagues to oppose not only this resolution, but we've had others that have come through before, and I think we've urged them to oppose those as well. But I'm going to urge my colleagues on the other side after this vote's over, and you're in the majority, so you can move this kind of stuff whether it really makes a difference or not. But hopefully, after we get past this moment, we can actually sit down and get back to the type of legislation that I worked with Congressman Hunt that can really make a difference to help make police officers safer, to help get more police officers on the street, and to praise all of them for the great work that they do. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his remarks, and I agree with him that we should stand in support of all of our law enforcement officers at the local, state, and federal level. And in addition to the work that we have done together on bills affecting law enforcement in the Judiciary Committee, I'm also honored to serve on the Commerce, Justice, Science Subcommittee of Appropriations, where we deal specifically with support for federal law enforcement as well as programs for state and local law enforcement. And I can commit to the gentleman that the appropriations process and under Chairman Cole's leadership will be focusing on providing that support for law enforcement across the country at all levels. And so I encourage him to keep a close watch on those bills as they move through, and hopefully we can get his support for those pieces of legislation that provide that funding. You know, we have loss of officers in every community, and during National Police Week, we pause to thank those brave men and women in blue, and in rural areas like mine, wearing brown uniforms as well, sheriff's deputies. And we remember those who were lost. We have had loss in the 6th Congressional District. In Bridgewater just recently, we had officers who we have lost, and it really does take a toll not just on the families of the victims, but on the entire community. And we want to make sure that that number is reduced, eliminated, and we can do that not only through funding efforts to support our police, but also through resolutions like this, where we try and reverse the trend that we've seen across the country, and in many Democrat-run cities, quite frankly, where the antagonistic attitude toward men and women in law enforcement has reached a fever pitch. And we have to turn that around. We have to restore that respect for law enforcement in our communities, that confidence in law enforcement in our communities. And through efforts like this, but also through efforts on the ground, nothing can replace support for law enforcement among city councils, among elected officials at the local level, among teachers, among community members. That's what's going to be ultimately the driving force behind the reversal in this anti-police, defund the police type attitude in our communities, and the restoration of that respect and a reduction in crime that would follow. Because if you respect the police, hopefully it follows logically that you're not going to be someone who wants to cross the police in a way that by violating the laws. So we will continue to push legislation like this and legislation that we work on in a bipartisan manner. I'm sorry the gentleman says he can't support this resolution, but I hope that we continue to work on these types of bills as we move forward. As to the issue of gun violence, I would say that efforts to raise the age at which adults in this country can exercise their constitutional rights to defend their homes, defend their families, defend their communities, are not the answer. We only need to look in the District of Columbia to see what has happened when the age at which juvenile crimes, the age for covering crimes and determining that they are juveniles has been raised over the years and is now 25. If you're under 25 years old in the District of Columbia and you commit a crime, you can be considered a juvenile for purposes of sentencing and for purposes of punishment. That doesn't make sense. So we passed a bill this week that actually lowers that age from 24 down to 18, because truly, if you commit a crime and you are a juvenile, and I worked in juvenile courts, so I understand that there need to be different approaches to punishing juveniles. They need much more restorative processes that bring them back to a point at which they will be law-abiding adults. But once they're adults, once they're 18, treating them as juveniles only without any kind of punishment for the crimes that are committed, that it really does nothing but encourage that type of illegal behavior once they reach adulthood. So we don't think that raising ages and pretending someone who's an adult is not an adult and can't exercise all of the rights enshrined to them under the Constitution is appropriate. So with that, I would like to yield such time as he may consume to the gentleman from Minnesota, great law enforcement officer, and Mr. Stauber.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm frustrated and angry, but also deeply saddened. The law enforcement profession is an honorable one. To have so much compassion for others that you are willing to put your life on the line. It is, as we say, a call to service, and not many hear that call today. If you had asked me a few years ago if my children should become law enforcement officers, I would have undoubtedly said yes. But after these last few years, observing the treatment of our law enforcement officers, I would have to think twice about my answer. Since 2020, I have watched the law enforcement profession become a punching bag, scapegoated by rabid media pundits more interested in clickbait than the facts, villainized by Hollywood, and disparaged by city councils, members of this Congress, both men and women, and even our president. Yet all these people expect law enforcement to respond to the calls for service. They expect them to take the verbal assault and show up with a smile on their face, ready to serve. The wonderful thing about my brothers and sisters in uniform is that despite this treatment and abuse, they will show up. They will answer every call. They will sacrifice their safety for others. They will help protect their community no matter how much ridicule or resentment they face. But I am here to say the things that they can't. I'm here to protect my brothers and sisters in the blue and brown because others won't. Enough is enough. Law enforcement officers deserve our respect, our admiration, and our support. To provide anything less is unacceptable. The resolution before us acknowledges the change in attitude towards law enforcement over the last few years and the subsequent violence directed toward them. It acknowledges that they respond to the calls for service no matter who is on the other line. It acknowledges that the job has only become more dangerous and more mentally and physically exhausting, yet they still show up for work, not knowing if they've kissed their families goodbye for the last time. Importantly, this resolution also acknowledges that we, in this chamber, set the standard. We are the ones who must demonstrate a respect for the rule of law and a respect for our law enforcement officers if we are to expect the public to do the same. We must do so in our actions, in our conversations, and even the policies we consider. Bills that never become law can have the most staggering ripple effect. They can persuade local municipalities to implement soft-on-crime policies and strip law enforcement of resources. They can encourage the public to cheat, steal, and disrespect fellow community members. They can cause good, noble people to change their minds about entering the profession that I love so much, which is law enforcement. Actions have consequences, and our communities are suffering as a result. But let's take this moment to learn to change for the better. We can rise to the moment, stand with our law enforcement officers, reestablish law and order, and bring safety back to our communities. I encourage all of my colleagues to vote on this resolution. Mr. Chair, I want to take a few minutes to respond to my good friend and colleague who's managing the time on the other side of the aisle. Talked about his support for law enforcement, what he did. I want to read something to you. Quote, "It is not enough to hold the officers involved accountable. In the past year, police killings have reached a record high. Rogue, militant policing continues to run rampant across our country, threatening public safety and the lives of millions of Americans. Our antiquated criminal justice system has long allowed law enforcement to utilize excessive force and prejudicial policing practices while avoiding accountability. We need extensive reform now with de-escalation training, selective bias training, and better policing. I am urging my colleagues in Congress to pass the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Additionally, we must invest in our communities through unarmed first responder agencies, mental health and crisis support treatment options, diversion programs, community intervention groups, and reentry programs. We can and must do better to avoid tragedies and improve public safety. I will never stop working to support and enact changes that will make our country safer for all Americans. The first part, this whole quote that I read, was from my colleague who's managing time on the other side of the aisle. That's horrendous, because the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act takes away qualified immunity. You take away qualified immunity from the American law enforcement officer, it will devastate our communities. It will devastate recruitment, retention, morale. You have to be kidding me. Mr. Chair, this is what we're dealing with. I became a law enforcement officer in late '94 when Ron Ryan and Tim Jones from the St. Paul Police Department were ambushed and killed. I was a young officer. I didn't even have my funeral uniform yet. But I went to those funerals wondering what profession I was getting in, even taking a second thought whether I should stay in this profession. 1 week on the job. In Cottage Grove, Minnesota, I was working the night shift. Myself and my partner at night, Tom Hewlin, stopped at a gas station, have a cup of coffee, midnight shift, talk about our families. We split up. He went one way, I went the other. Within 3 minutes, he's screaming for help. He needs help on a traffic stop. I couldn't get there fast enough. When my squad car got on that scene, the whole engine was shaking. I couldn't get to him fast enough. He was being attacked by the driver, the dog, and the female passenger was crying. We find out when Officer Hewlin went to make that traffic stop, the driver said to the female passenger, "I'm going to kill him." When Officer Hewlin went up to the window, the suspect was digging in his armrest, trying to get a handgun. And the female passenger was trying to move it away from him to save the officer's life. I got there during the struggle. And I looked 5 minutes before that. He and I were having a cup of coffee talking about our families and our futures. That's how quick it can change. And the cavalier attitude of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is unconscionable. Where were they during the Summer of Love 2020 when officers were getting ambushed? Where were they, Mr. Speaker? On December 15th of 1995 at 10:32 p.m. at the intersection of 6th Avenue East and 4th Street in Duluth, Minnesota, a career criminal tried to shoot me in the head and kill me, and I survived by the grace of God. A career criminal that should have been put away years ago. Don't tell me we don't have issues. We have issues with prosecution too. The federal prosecutor in Minneapolis would not charge him with felon in the possession of a handgun. We couldn't figure out why. Off-duty police officer shot in the head by a career criminal that should never have had the gun. Wouldn't prosecute. But it was about 8 years later when the Drug Task Force supervisor woke me up in the middle of the night, called me and said, "Pete, we got him. He's going to prison for a long time. We've got the stolen guns on him. He's not getting away with this one." It took him years after to put this guy away. Then on a London Road in Duluth, Minnesota, suspects tried to kidnap some folks. I get the call. with my supervisors, and I don't get to choose what call I go on. I don't get to say, I don't want to go on this gun call. I don't want to go on that. I get the call and we go. Then every single police officer in this nation does the same thing. Kidnapping, suspect with a gun. I go clear the room, Mr. Chair, and the suspect comes flying in the room, points a handgun right at me, pulls the trigger. And by the grace of God, it didn't go off. And you know why I knew it didn't go off? It happened so fast. I saw it in his eyes. I was in a street fight for my life. And yes, I needed some help after that call. And that's why I'm adamant that the professionals that serve our communities get the mental health they need, and they need it now sometimes. So to listen to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle pretend they support law enforcement, they've never worn the boots, or many of them never worn the boots. They've never answered a call. 2 shot, officer needs help. They've never, most of them have never had a suspect with a rifle in his hand ready to kill you. And I have to make a decision, Mr. Chair. If that rifle comes up, I have to save my life. I have to do that. I don't want to, but his actions are causing me to save my own life and the life of others. Mr. Chair, the honorable men and women in law enforcement in America deserve better treatment. This week we celebrated Law Enforcement Week, Police Week. We saw the men and women in uniform, the proud men and women in uniform, come to our nation's capital and be proud of their profession. This week, Law Enforcement Week, should be 52 weeks a year. Every week we should support law enforcement and protect law enforcement. I am sick and tired of seeing this happen to law enforcement men and women, Mr. Chair, throughout this nation. There's members in this body that stand in a microphone and vilify law enforcement. They'll go to their funerals, though. They'll go to their funerals. When it comes to supporting a legislation that I have here, a resolution regarding violence against law enforcement. My colleague says it's partisan. You have to be kidding me. A resolution regarding violence against law enforcement officers. And my good friend calls it partisan. And yes, defund the police was real. We're seeing the effects of it today. The recruitment, retention, morale are at the lowest ever. Shortages, Mr. Chair, in police departments across this nation, including my hometown. They want to sit up here in Police Week and pretend, we're not going to have it. You either support law enforcement or you don't. And you know what, Mr. Chair? We need to, most departments today wear body cameras or have squad car cameras in squad cameras. We as a nation, cooler heads must prevail on the support for law enforcement. We have to understand what they go through. We must push comply now, challenge later. Comply now, challenge later. Mr. Chair, in 23 years of law enforcement, when I place somebody under arrest, please put your hands behind your back, you're under arrest, palms out, don't resist, you understand. And I placed my handcuffs on them, gapped them, double locked them, escorted to the right rear seat of my squad car. When they obeyed my lawful order, Mr. Chair, I didn't get hurt. The suspects didn't get hurt. The public didn't get hurt. When a law enforcement gives you a lawful order, obey her. Obey a lawful order. When a law enforcement officer says, put your hands on the steering wheel, put your hands on the steering wheel. When a law enforcement officer says, sit on the sidewalk for safety purposes, sit on the sidewalk. When a law enforcement officer says, you are under arrest for domestic assault, obey a lawful order, Mr. Chair. Where did society, where did we want to be judge, juror, executioner on the streets of the United States of America? It's wrong. Mr. Chair, we have to change, and it's up to leadership in our nation's capital and elected leaders at all levels in every state to the men and women who wear the uniform in this great nation. I will tell you, it's a noble, honorable profession. And no matter what you hear from some folks that you're not wanted, it's unwarranted, it's not a good career, I will tell you, I spent 23 years as a police officer in the city of Duluth, Minnesota. I helped build a community policing program. I love the profession, and I enjoyed the profession. Yes, Mr. Chair, the darkest hours of someone's life we deal with, and we deal with compassion and professionalism. It's not easy, but we need the good men and women. And Mr. Chair, we also need people that perform violent acts against innocent citizens. We need to hold them accountable. We need prosecutors to hold them accountable when they perform a violent crime. And I will tell you, in closing, Mr. Chair, we in this country, we better reshape our thinking and our focus towards safety of all of us. And we do that by supporting the men and women in uniform. And we do that by electing leaders at all levels of government that support law enforcement. We in law enforcement want to be held accountable, okay? But let me tell you something. Right now, we have a rogue attorney general in Hennepin County, Minnesota, that is bringing murder charges against Minnesota trooper Ryan Londrigan for what he did to save his partner's life. And the use of force expert opined to that the trooper Londrigan used lawful force to save his partner's life. He's now being charged in Hennepin County by an anti-law enforcement attorney general. In fact, she can't even find an attorney in her own department, Mr. Chair, to prosecute the case. She's spending over $1 million of taxpayer money, Mr. Chair, to come to this town and find a prosecutor. It's unbelievable. And the people of Minnesota and Hennepin County should understand what's happening to that good man, that good trooper and his family. I will stand up to the good men in law enforcement no matter what I have to do. No matter what I have to do. Mr. Chair, I will say this. If we don't have a change of attitude towards law enforcement, this country is going to be in trouble. And before I close, I want to ask, this is an ask to the American people, every American. The next time you see a law enforcement officer, I want you to look her in her eye and you tell her, thank you for your service. We appreciate you. she will take that response and carry it with her the rest of the day, rest of her shift, and forever. We need to show appreciation. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
We reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I've got to say I am deeply shocked and offended by the statements that were just made, especially regarding me, but the larger context too. So the gentleman from Minnesota read a quote that he attributed to me, and it's a statement I made, but it was about the killing of Tyrese Nichols. Now, Tyree Nichols was the gentleman in Tennessee who was beaten to death over a period of like 10 to 15 minutes by, I believe it was 6 police officers. In fact, I remember watching the video, and there were multiple videos because they had different angles. One of the officers who had been beating him got tired, stepped away so he could catch his breath, and then came back to continue beating him. I'd never seen anything like it. I was shocked. I had cases when I was the state's attorney where police officers used excessive force, and I prosecuted those cases. In some cases, we convicted those individuals. But I guess my colleague from Minnesota thought that the beating death of Mr. Nichols was good policing. But keep something in mind. The chief of the police of that department fired those officers because he recognized that that had crossed the line that good police officers recognize and follow every day, under every circumstance and in every situation. I thought that's what we were going to honor this police week, to sort of hold up the Tyree Nichols scenario as an example of what police officers are supposed to be doing during police week is insane. I can't believe it. But that's what he did. Let me say this. It's important for us to make sure that we walk and chew gum at the same time. We want to honor good policing for sure, because every community needs it. We need police officers who go out and do they respond to calls for robberies or shootings or whatever. We need detectives who respond in homicide and rape process, both at the local, state, and federal level. We definitely need it. But even they've recognized over time that the bad apples, and the ones in Tyree Nichols' case were clearly not just bad apples, but about as bad as you can get. They have to be separated out because it's important for the police to police themselves. I know it's hard, but we've got to make sure that they do it. And he mentioned body cameras a moment ago. Guess why we have body cameras? That was one of the innovations that was made to address excessive force. And guess what? One of the things that's led to is better policing. When I first ran for state's attorney in Prince George's County, one of the issues I ran on was videotaping interrogations. And I wrote an op-ed. It was called Safeguards for the Innocent. And I was joined by the former head of the homicide unit here in Washington, D.C. We wrote it together. And the reason we wrote it was because we knew that if you videotape these interrogations, and we'd had a flurry of false confessions that had been made in Prince George's County, and we knew they were false because they were proven to be innocent by DNA evidence. So we knew they were false confessions. And so we made this change to try and address that. And guess what happened? Initially, the police officers had opposed it, but the good detectives realized quickly that the videotape showed the great work that they were doing and they were going about it the right way. And the juries appreciated that too, because then we could just bring it in, set up the video, hit the tape, and the jurors could see for themselves and make the decision. That's good policing. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we hold police officers, just like we do prosecutors or any other law enforcement profession, to a basic level of following the law, even as they try and protect us from misconduct. Now, I guess this is kind of the par for the course now for my Republican colleagues. The January 6th piece, for example, we've got people running around on the other side of the aisle who are calling the perpetrators of January 6th, the rioters of January 6th, they're calling them hostages and patriots, the people who were patriots who participated in it, according to them, and the ones who've been prosecuted and convicted and jailed, even though I think over 900 of them pled guilty, but others were convicted after jury trials. They've had their day in court, they've had their due process, they were rightly convicted and held accountable, they've been sentenced to jail, but we still have people over there calling them patriots and hostages, even though 5 officers died as a result of January 6th. And many others were injured too. So I'm hoping, again, this is Police Week, and I'm hoping that we can get back to trying doing things in a bipartisan way here. But based on what I heard from my colleague from Minnesota, that's not likely to happen. It's important to make sure that we do this. We've got to make sure that we recognize the challenges we've faced in law enforcement. And I support law enforcement, as I mentioned earlier. We've got legislation to try and increase the number of police officers who are going to be out there on the street because we need more police officers on the street. But the George Floyd Act, which was referenced, I think, a minute ago, is aimed at making sure that in addition to having more on the street, they do the job in the right way. Now, when I first got elected, we didn't have iPhones very often. And so we'd prosecute these cases. We'd present the evidence to the jury, excessive force cases, and many times the jury would reject it. One of the transformations that happened with the iPhone, though, was that people standing there on the street while excessive force was taking place, they videotaped it. And then they were able to bring that to the police, and cases that probably wouldn't even have been charged previously were not only charged, but led to convictions. The George Floyd scenario, the person who that legislation's named after, is a paradigm example of that. Derek Chauvin was there with his neck with his knee on his neck for 9.5 minutes. The police report that he filled out and the other colleagues on the street made no mention of all of that, but the videos made it clear that Derek Chauvin had basically just strangled him to death with his knee. And he was held accountable. And the other officers around him, who basically did nothing while it was happening, they were held accountable too. Now, hopefully my colleagues, maybe my colleague from Minnesota, had that in mind when he made some of the statements he just said a few minutes ago. I sure hope not, because officers who do that belong in jail. They shouldn't have a badge, a gun, and a license to kill. That has to be given to the people who we can trust to enforce the law in the right way. And the vast majority of police officers, that's how they do it, and that's why we appreciate and respect them. But when they cross the line, I hope we don't have people like the gentleman from Minnesota who's going to act like that's okay, because it's not. We've got to hold them accountable. Now, a minute ago I mentioned serious legislation. It's a little surprising to me we're having such a debate like this over legislation that's just a resolution, basically. It speaks only of defund the police and the like. But the Democrats in the last Congress, for example, we passed meaningful reforms to support police, even though in many of the instances they were opposed by Republicans. So, last Police Week we passed H.R. 6943, the Public Safety Officer Support Act, which extended death benefits to law enforcement officers with PTSD. It came over the objection of 17 Republicans, including 4 on the Judiciary Committee. Last Police Week, H.R. 2992, the Traumatic Brain Injury Law Enforcement and Training Act, passed legislation as well. 21 Republicans objected to that as well. Now, we keep passing legislation, or we did when the Democrats were in control, to actually provide additional resources and benefits to police officers who get injured in the line of duty, and I think that's important for us to continue to do. But our colleagues aren't doing that. They're bringing this political legislation, and it got real political a minute ago when the gentleman from Minnesota was up there, frankly kind of ranting about things he'd attributed to me, which I think was wrong and incorrect. But more importantly, things he keeps trying to attribute to Democrats and the change in policy. A couple other quick points about some of the things he said. The decline in police officers. Now, I got to be clear. One of the things we have in the bill I did with Mr. Hunt was we got a report that's going to come and study this, because I think it's going to help address a lot of the misinformation that's coming out on the other side about why we're having some shortages. And they're saying it's based on the defund the police slogan, but the roots of these shortages started many, many years ago. And in some instances, in some jurisdictions, we just have a cycle of people who are coming up for their retirements at their 20 and 30-year marks. But in any event, let's try and make sure we get the evidence and the data so we can correct those challenges. It's not just fixing a slogan on the street. It's a dangerous job, doesn't pay as much as it should. Many of the officers or potential officers find that they can have jobs that pay as much and don't have to work as hard. For example, Homeland Security, I remember the Border Patrol agents testifying that they're having trouble retaining officers at the border, not because of a defund the police slogan, but because they can leave the job and make more money doing other things and stay in the same community, and it's less taxing than being an officer. If we're honest about it, then we can come up with better solutions to try and retain them, like maybe paying them more money. But if we just keep spreading rhetoric about this is defund the police, we won't fix the problem and we won't get more officers. If money is the issue, and of course it's a factor, then just standing here and haranguing about defunding the police doesn't fix it. We have to find ways to raise the salaries and help attract and retain more of them to go out on the street. Now, I'm going to stop with this at the moment. You know, I first went into law enforcement in 1990 as a prosecutor, and I took it seriously then. The gentleman on the other side is accusing Democrats of not being serious about police. We have police officers, former police officers here on this side of the aisle who are Democrats, and I know them all across the country. And not only that, every time I've run for office, I've been endorsed by the FOP in my jurisdiction. So it's a little unfortunate to sort of use those kinds of attacks to justify the resolution that is proposed here. Let's get serious. Let's get back to doing things that actually will address the problems and retain more police officers, recruit more police officers, address the concerns that we have with respect to keeping them safe on the street. And yes, gun violence is a big factor in the dangers that they face on the streets. And so I think it's kind of hard to be serious about protecting them if we're not even going to discuss that. My colleague from Virginia mentioned that he thinks we want to make sure that they're 21. If you wait till they're 21, it undermines their Second Amendment rights. And I appreciate that. I don't agree with that take, but let me say this. Ghost guns, I haven't come across anybody that thinks those make sense. They are intentionally designed to avoid prosecution. They don't have any numbers on them in order to avoid being tracked in the event of use for a criminal enterprise. And the use of ghost guns and crimes on the street is exploding. We need to get our Republican colleagues to help us support legislation like that. We're having trouble finding it, but today would be the day. Oh, and by the way, we're talking about killings on the street. It's handguns primarily, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, that are leading to officers' deaths on the streets. So if we're really serious about protecting police officers, can't we do something to try and address that? Can't we do something to try and limit the number of guns on the street? Oh, and by the way, too, I know that the argument's going to be, hey, you guys are soft on crime and all of that. But remember, a lot of the people who commit these crimes don't have prior offenses. Like the two that killed the deputies, the guy that killed the two deputies in my jurisdiction, Arno and Magruder, he didn't have any prior record. He had mental health issues. We can't just assume that all of these issues revolve around people who have long criminal records, because they don't. And many times police officers are killed on the street by people with no prior records. Let's try and address all of these issues in a serious way, in a bipartisan way, because that's the way to actually help keep our police officers safe on the street. And with that, I reserve.
Reserves. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
To inquire how much time is remaining on each side.
The gentleman from Virginia has 1 minute remaining.
And the other side?
The gentleman from Maryland has 3.5 minutes remaining.
We reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman is recognized to close.
Mr. Speaker, no member of Congress questions the difficulty, danger, or stress associated with serving in law enforcement. We're grateful for each and every federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement officer, agent, or employee working daily, putting their lives on the line to keep us safe in every corner and territory of this nation. This week, we should come together to honor their dedication to their jobs and communities, lift up the names of those officers and agents who gave their lives in service, and wrap our arms around their loved ones left behind. Sadly, Republicans have chosen partisanship over bipartisanship at this time. I therefore must oppose H.Res. 1213, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, we should all come together. We should all be standing united on this floor in support of law enforcement today. Unfortunately, it's the other side that is going to object to this legislation in support of police and objecting to the defund the police movement. And yes, that rhetoric has come from members in this chamber on the other side. And yes, that has been followed up by action in cities across the country. We just had a field hearing in Philadelphia where they defunded the police, where they took money away from police departments in Philadelphia. So the gentleman may call the testimony of the gentleman from Minnesota, our colleague, former law enforcement officer, ranting. But instead, I believe it was a passionate defense of each and every law enforcement officer in this country. We must stand and back the blue. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 1227, the previous question is ordered on the resolution and the preamble. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to and without objection.
Do you really? As for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays have been requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. The members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.